how it works at cross purposes with itself. We don't need an external threat. We are dissolving from inside. We are forced to do things that make no sense. If you look at most state government budgets, you will see that one of the major discretionary items, the money that they can save, is in the area of public education, and particularly public higher education. So let me remind you of a statistic I have mentioned here in the past. Every reasonable commentator, left, right, and center, about the American economy in the years ahead, faced with world competition, must produce a high quantity and a high quality of skilled labor. That is an essential ingredient to a successful economic future. Here in the United States, higher education is where we train our skilled labor force. Colleges and universities. Right now in the United States, approximately 15 million Americans attend colleges and universities. Under 3 million of them go to private schools. Over 12 million of them go to public higher education. Every state, because it's a state responsibility in this country, not local, with the exception of New York, but very few places, and not federal, it's the states that do public higher education. With almost no exceptions, the states are cutting outlays on public higher education. As in California, as I quoted to you before, $1.4, $1.5 billion taken from a budget. Therefore, what? We have an economy in an economic crisis that is trying to relieve the symptoms of crisis by cutting the major institution that determines the quality of the future labor force. That's an internal self-destruction. Don't need a foreign enemy. We are shooting ourselves collectively in the foot as we proceed. Governors everywhere are cutting, and the same is true here in New York, outlays on public higher education, the single most important institution in shaping the skill of our labor force. Very strange system that functioned in this way. What happened to the mass of American people? Well, again, not much has changed from last month. The unemployment rate is the same, or actually slightly higher, and the rate of foreclosures is slightly higher than it was a month ago. It was slowed for a while because the sloppiness of the record keeping, some of you may have noticed that, was so abysmal on the part of the banks that there were lawsuits, actual and potential, that could have hurt many of the banks and lenders because they had phonied the numbers, phonied the signatures, leaped over steps that are legally required, made it, for example, very difficult in many cases for a prosecution of a person who stopped paying their mortgage because you could not legally identify who held the mortgage, who actually owned the property, because it had been sold and resold so often and the record keeping had been so poor that a good lawyer could make it impossible to throw someone out of their home because the lawyer could question the status of the action being brought by whom. You don't own it. You can't prove you're the owner of this house by a legal trail that will hold up in court. Some of this has been resolved, and so the banks have gotten some adjustments, including a lovely law passed in the Congress that eliminates some of their need to do these things, so they can now resume, which is why the numbers are going up. The actual foreclosures in the United States are going up, which means we are a society that has side by side millions of unoccupied homes side by side with millions of homeless people. And again, if I had time, I'd interrupt now and play the national anthem, which would be an appropriate musical interlude as we proceed. So unemployment is not resolved, and there is no sign of it getting better. Again, the disaster in cities and towns, if we have more Camden, New Jersey stories, unemployment will get worse as the public sector becomes savage. It was the private sector that took it in the chin the first 3 years of this crisis. Now the focus is moving to the public sector. For those of you interested in the American labor movement and its history, here's something to think about. Over the last 50 years, the decline in the American labor movement has been most pronounced in the private sector. Something like 7% of private sector employees in the United States are now represented by a union. Let me repeat that. 93% of Americans working for a private employer have no union. 7% have a union. It's a good number to remember if you're in conversation with friends and neighbors and you hear one of them, or maybe more than one of them if you have a bad collection of friends and neighbors, telling you about the problem of unions in America. And this should elicit spitting or some other suitable response to the notion of a powerful union movement when it represents 7% of the private sector. When it comes to the public sector, or to be more accurate now, when it came to the public sector, the numbers are much better. Something like 14, 15% of public employees are in unions. The fact that now the focus of this crisis has shifted from the private sector's unemployment and beginning to focus on the public sector's unemployment means that the employer, the public agency, federal, state, and local, is under enormous pressure to lay off workers and to break union agreements and to break unions, to make it easier to do what it is they hope to achieve under these circumstances. This is a very serious threat building to the only place left where the American labor movement has any kind of real hold. Were the American labor movement, particularly the public employee unions, mobilized and aware of this situation, they would have, and they should have, built up over the last 3 years the set of defenses against this impending attack that I don't myself notice. And that's very scary, most of all for them. Okay, what has this all produced? Well, I think the fact that the recovery remains so uneven, having been focused on the financial industry almost exclusively, with a little fallout to other employers, non-financial, but with no mass impact on the unemployed. Real wages are not going up. By the way, this has to be stressed. If you have 10% unemployment, if you have in addition to the 10% unemployed, more millions of people in a part-time job who would jump if there were a full-time job available, and additional millions who've given up looking and therefore are not counted, the chances for wages to go up again are, of course, zero. So real wages are not rising, the wage level is tending down. And that will continue so long as the unemployment. Why is that important? Because Americans are tapped out with credit. They've borrowed so much money that they have to use a disproportionate amount of their wages just to service the debt, to pay the interest and the repayment program. If wages keep trending down and the debt sits there, the crunch on people gets worse. So the fact that wages are not going up is itself a major depressant on the economy. In a way, it's unemployment making itself worse. That might have been alleviated had we had in the United States over the last 2 years a different response to our unemployment problem. And this ties into something we talked about at earlier updates in previous months. If you recall, I drew your attention to the fact that we have in American history a radically different way, on record, of responding to huge unemployment of the sort we have now. In the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt went on the radio, 1930, late 33, early 34, and he spoke on the radio and he said basically the following line: if the private sector in the United States cannot or will not employ millions of Americans, then there is no other option, notice the language, there is no other option than having the federal government employ those people. From 1934 to 1941, the federal government of the United States created and filled 11 million jobs. At today's population, that would be roughly twice that number. That would take care of our unemployment problem. The interesting thing is not only that we didn't do that now, but that even with a president from the Democratic Party and a Senate and a House controlled by the Democratic Party, there was not even a debate over such a program, let alone its implementation. By the way, had the government come in with a massive program of federal employment, not only would it have given those workers jobs and transformed their personal lives, their sense of themselves, their maintenance of skills, it would have also meant they could maintain their mortgage payments and drastically reduce the housing crisis. They would have had incomes to spend on goods and services that would give still other Americans jobs, making those goods and services. And most interesting for you to think about, had the government come in to hire them, it probably would have exercised an upward pressure on wages, because the government would have been competing against private industry, which is why private industry had no interest in this program. But if it had done so, and it had raised wages, it actually would have made the American working class able to sustain its debts, because the wage increase would have given them a greater set of resources with which to do that, and that would have altered the credit conditions in the United States, which are now universally recognized to be undercutting any recovery. So it would have been an interesting response with an interesting set of positives. Not only don't we have it, we have a political structure that could not allow it to be debated. Neither President Bush nor President Obama, to my knowledge, ever said a word about such a program. And by the way, if any of you are interested or not familiar with this, go get a history book on the 1930s. You'll read about the Civilian Conservation Corps, a very interesting public employment program, way before its time, interested in and devoted to ecological preservation. Way back then, they reclaimed flooded lands, they built new beds for rivers to take so there wouldn't be so much loss of water, they cleaned up destroyed areas, they built national parks that many of you visit. All kinds of useful social programs were performed by them. The WPA, another program that's worth reading about, was a government program in the 1930s. Works Projects Administration is what WPA stands for. It hired artists, singers, actresses, sculptors, painters, poets. It formed traveling artists